3 years is a long time to plan a single event. The Galactic Accord Summit had required every one of those 3 years and had consumed a significant portion of the diplomatic bandwidth of 23 civilizations in the process. Not because any single element of it was complicated on its own. Each individual piece of the summit's architecture was manageable. But 23 civilizations each had positions and histories and relationships with every other civilization in the room, and the work of building a framework that all 23 could sit inside simultaneously was the kind of work that accumulated slowly and required constant attention and occasionally required starting a particular section over from the beginning when something that had seemed agreed turned out to have been agreed differently by different parties. The summit's purpose was significant enough to justify all of it. Humanity's formal integration into the senior tier of galactic membership was not a routine diplomatic event. The senior tier was where the civilizations that shaped the galactic community's actual decisions operated, not the junior membership that attended sessions and participated in discussions and had their interests considered, but the tier where the framework itself was built and maintained and revised. Getting there required a formal integration process that involved all existing senior members and that produced a document that established the terms, rights, and responsibilities of the new senior member going forward. Humanity had been working toward this for 40 years. The other civilizations had been watching humanity work toward it for 40 years and had their own views about the timing and the terms and the implications of the integration, and those views had needed to be negotiated into the document that everyone was going to sign at the end of the summit. 3 years of negotiation had produced a document that was ready to be signed. The neutral station selected for the summit was the Accord Station in the Middle Systems, a facility that had been built specifically for high-level diplomatic events and that belonged to no single civilization and carried the symbolic weight of genuine neutral ground. It was large enough to host 23 delegations with their full staff complements and had the facilities that a multi-day summit required: session chambers, delegation offices, accommodation, the logistical infrastructure that made a gathering of this scale functional. The Summit Logistics Office had been preparing for 3 months. The logistics coordinator was a precise and experienced woman named Director Carol Hayes, who had managed 3 previous major summits and who had an organized and thorough approach to the work that meant her preparation checklists were comprehensive and her follow-through on each item was reliable. She had managed the delegation confirmation process, the escort vessel registrations, the berthing assignments, the session scheduling, the catering arrangements for 23 species, the security protocols, and the 100 other operational requirements that a summit of this significance generated. The escort vessel protocol was one item on a very long list. The protocol was standard for multi-civilization summits. Each delegation was permitted 1 escort vessel, designated in advance, sized appropriately for a diplomatic occasion. The sizing language was intentionally general because appropriate for a diplomatic occasion covered a range and different civilizations had different ideas about what the range included, and the protocol had been written to accommodate that flexibility without being so open that it created problems. Each delegation had submitted their escort vessel designation as part of the confirmation process. Carol's logistics team had processed 23 confirmations and made the corresponding berthing assignments based on the designations provided. The Thessari had designated their newest ceremonial cruiser, a sleek and impressive vessel that the Thessari diplomatic service used for significant occasions and that communicated the seriousness with which they regarded the summit. Carol's team assigned it a premium berth in the station's main diplomatic docking section. The Oresi had designated their flagship diplomatic vessel. The Oresi flagship was the largest diplomatic vessel in the known galaxy by a margin that had been a point of some pride for the Oresi for several decades. It was genuinely impressive, long, well-appointed, designed to communicate standing and capability simultaneously. It required a berth at the outer section of the diplomatic docking ring because the inner berths were not dimensioned for it. Carol's team had made the adjustment without comment. Several other civilizations had designated vessels that required various berth adjustments and logistics notes. This was normal. 23 civilizations meant 23 different scales and configurations, and the logistics of accommodating that range was exactly the kind of work that Carol's team did well. When humanity's confirmation arrived, it included the escort vessel designation in the standard field of the standard form. NS constant. Carol's logistics coordinator, a young staff member named Rob who was handling the confirmation processing and who was thorough and efficient and had been working through the 23 confirmations in sequence, received the form, noted the vessel designation, confirmed the arrival window, and made the preliminary berth assignment based on the standard diplomatic escort sizing. He moved on to the next confirmation. The berth assignment for the ANS constant sat in the logistics system with the preliminary designation that Rob had assigned it, a standard outer ring berth, the kind used for mid to large diplomatic escorts, the kind the system defaulted to when the vessel class field was filled in with a designation that the system didn't have a specific record for. The system didn't have a record for ANS constant because the ANS constant was new enough that it hadn't appeared in any previous approach coordination database that the station system pulled from. This was a gap that Carol's team would normally catch in the verification pass, the secondary check where the vessel designations were confirmed against available registry data. The verification pass was scheduled for the week before the summit. It ran on schedule. The verification coordinator, a different staff member from Rob, someone with more experience who handled the secondary check specifically, pulled up the registry query for each designated vessel in sequence and confirmed the specifications against the berth assignment. He reached the ANS constant. He ran the registry query. The query returned results. He looked at the results. He looked at the berth assignment Rob had made. He looked at the results again. Then he walked down the corridor to Carol's office and knocked on the door, and when she said come in he came in and closed the door behind him, which was not his normal practice for routine verification updates, and the door closing was the first thing that told Carol this was not a routine update before he said anything. He showed her the registry results. Carol looked at them. She had been in logistics coordination for 18 years and she had a comprehensive understanding of vessel classifications and what they meant in practical operational terms. What vessels of various sizes required in terms of approach corridors, berthing infrastructure, clearance zones. She looked at the registry results for the ANS constant for a long time. Then she looked at the berth assignment. Then she looked at the registry results again. She said, "We need to revise the berthing plan." Her coordinator said yes. She said, "Significantly." He said yes again. Carol pulled up the station's full berthing diagram on her desk display. She looked at the available options. She looked at the registry results. She looked at the approach corridor specifications. She looked at the outer sensor range and the holding position parameters that the station's approach management system used for vessels that were too large for direct docking. She made a series of notes. Then she said that they were going to need to brief the station director and that she wanted to do it before the end of the day because the director needed time to think about this before the summit opened. She also said that they might want to send an updated notification to the attending delegations about the observation deck hours for Monday morning. Her coordinator asked why specifically Monday morning. Carol looked at the registry results one more time. She said, "Because that's when the ANS constant arrives and I think people are going to want to see it." She said it in the level and professional tone she used for operational information. But she said it. Monday morning on the Accord station had the specific energy of the day before something significant. The summit was scheduled to open Tuesday at 0900 and the station had been building toward that opening for 3 weeks. Delegations arriving in sequence, the logistical machinery of a 23 civilization diplomatic event running through its final preparations, staff moving through corridors with the purposeful efficiency of people who had a checklist and were working through it. The ceremonial chamber had been inspected twice. The document protocols had been verified. The catering arrangements for 23 species with 23 different dietary requirements had been confirmed and reconfirmed. Monday was the last day of preparation and the station had the feeling of a held breath. Approach coordinator Yvonne had been on the morning shift since 0600. She was a methodical and experienced operator who had been working approach control at various coalition and neutral stations for 11 years. She had managed the arrivals of most of the summit delegations over the previous week. The Thessari ceremonial cruiser, the Oresi diplomatic flagship, the Drenali delegation transport, 11 others, and each arrival had been processed with the professional efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times and found it neither exciting nor stressful but simply the work that needed doing. The outer sensor network registered the emergent signature at 0743. Standard notification. A jump transit completing at the primary approach point, which was the designated entry corridor for summit attendees. Yvonne pulled up the approach management interface and began the standard confirmation sequence. The automated identification query that went out to any vessel entering the approach corridor and returned the vessel's registry data, designation, and current operational configuration. The response came back in under 10 seconds. Clean return, no anomalies in the signal. NS constant. Human registry. Diplomatic escort configuration. Ceremonial approach lighting active. Everything correct. The human delegation's escort vessel was the last expected arrival before the summit opened and the confirmation data matched the pre-filed approach authorization exactly. Yvonne noted the arrival in the log and moved to the next step of the standard sequence. The scaling analysis that established the vessel's position and approach vector for traffic management purposes. The scaling analysis processed alongside the identification confirmation. They usually finished at approximately the same time. Yvonne glanced at the scaling data. She looked at it more carefully. She ran it again. Not because standard procedure required her to run it twice. It didn't. Because the number it had returned the first time was not consistent with the number she was expecting based on 11 years of approach coordination experience, and she wanted to confirm that her instruments were working correctly before she accepted the number as accurate. The second run returned the same number. She looked at the identification data again. NS constant. Human registry. She checked the pre-filed approach authorization, the document that the Human Diplomatic Office had submitted 3 weeks ago when they confirmed their attendance and their escort vessel. She found the vessel designation field. NS constant. She looked at the scaling data. She looked at the approach corridor display where the vessel's position was now being tracked in real time as it moved through the post-transit deceleration phase. There was a particular cognitive experience that happened when a measurement returned a number that was accurate, and that was also not the number you had been prepared for. It was not the experience of the instrument being wrong. Yvonne had enough experience to know what instrument error felt like, and this was not that. It was the experience of the world being different from your model of it and the moment of adjustment between those two things. She was in that moment. She took a breath. Noted the approach data in the log with the additional notation that the scaling figures should be flagged for senior review. Then she picked up the internal communication line and called the senior station administrator. His name was Director Paul Hendricks. He had been running the Accord station for 6 years and had been in station administration for 20 before that. He was the kind of administrator who had seen enough things that his baseline for what warranted interruption was set considerably higher than most people's, and who had a reputation for receiving unusual information with the measured calm of someone who had learned that measured calm was the most useful first response to anything. Yvonne told him she had an approach confirmation on the human escort vessel and that there was a figure in the scaling data that she thought he should look at directly. Paul said he'd be there in a few minutes. He arrived in 4. Yvonne stepped aside from her console and let him look at the display. He looked at the identification data. He looked at the scaling data. He looked at the approach corridor display where the vessel was now clearly visible as a tracked contact moving at standard deceleration pace through the corridor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And this is the correct vessel. This is the one they filed in the approach authorization." Yvonne said yes. The identification beacon was confirmed and the registry data matched the pre-filed authorization exactly. Paul looked at the scaling data again with the expression of someone who has received accurate information and is in the process of understanding what it means in practical terms. He had managed summit logistics for 3 weeks. He had coordinated the arrivals of 22 previous delegations. He had a well-developed mental model of what an escort vessel looked like relative to the station and the other vessels in the approach corridor. He looked at the approach display where the contact was moving steadily through the corridor. He said, "All right." He said it in the specific tone of someone accepting a fact that was going to require subsequent adjustment of several other things and who was beginning the process of identifying which things. He went to the station's communication system and pulled up the all-delegation notification channel, the broadcast channel that went to every attending delegation's communication desk simultaneously. It was used for station-wide announcements relevant to all parties and had been used 3 times in the past week for logistical updates about session timing and facility access. He started typing the notification. He typed, "Priority notice to all attending delegations." He stopped. He needed to tell them what to do, but he also needed to tell them why, and he was standing at the communication terminal trying to find the words that accurately conveyed why, and the words were not immediately available because the words that accurately conveyed why were words he had not previously needed in the context of a diplomatic summit notification. He thought about it for a moment. Then he typed, "We invite all delegation representatives to the main observation deck at their earliest convenience. There is something you should see." He looked at it. It was not specific. It was not particularly informative about the nature of what they should see. It was also the most accurate thing he could write in the available words because it told them what to do and that there was a reason without trying to describe the reason in language that was not going to be adequate before they had seen it for themselves. He sent it. The notification went to 23 delegation communication desks simultaneously. Yvonne watched the approach display. The ANS constant was continuing its transit through the corridor at standard deceleration pace. The ceremonial lighting configuration it was running put a gold frequency signal on its navigation lights. The designation for a formal diplomatic approach, the correct lighting for the occasion, everything by the protocol. The protocol had been designed for vessels of a certain scale. The protocol did not have a provision for what to do when a vessel followed all the correct protocol requirements and was also a size that the people who wrote the protocol had not specifically anticipated when they wrote it. The Constant moved through the corridor with the patient and unhurried confidence of something that was exactly where it was supposed to be and knew it. On the observation deck, the first delegations were beginning to arrive. The notification went to 23 delegation communication desks at 0748. The response time varied by delegation. Some were already awake and at their desks when it arrived. Others had staff who handled overnight communications and who woke their principals with the message. A few delegation leads were in the middle of breakfast when their senior staff knocked on their door with the specific expression of someone who has read something and is not entirely sure how to describe it verbally. The observation deck filled over the course of about 20 minutes. The deck was a wide curved space on the station's upper level with a full viewport that looked out across the approach corridor and the broader space beyond it. It had been designed with diplomatic aesthetics in mind, good sight lines, comfortable standing space, the kind of room that communicated the station's commitment to providing quality facilities without being ostentatious about it. It had a rated capacity of about 80 people. By 0820 there were well over 100 people in it. The delegations had not come alone. Senior leads had brought technical advisors. Technical advisors had brought junior staff. Junior staff who had heard the message secondhand through the communication chains of their delegations had come on their own initiative because the message had communicated something through its careful vagueness that made people want to be in the room where the thing being referred to could be seen. The Thessari senior envoy arrived early and positioned herself at the front section of the viewport with her technical advisor beside her. She was a precise and experienced diplomat named Envoy Kala who had been in senior roles for 15 years and who had a reputation for the kind of composed analytical attention that processed new information quickly and accurately without visible disruption to her external presentation. She stood at the viewport and looked at the approach corridor display panel to the left of the main window, which was showing the ANS Constant's position and approach vector in the standard tracking format. She looked at the tracking data. Then she looked at the viewport where the Constant was still distant enough that it was a point of light rather than a resolved shape. She asked her technical advisor what the scaling data said. He told her. She asked a follow-up question about the power readings from the station's passive sensor array. He told her that too. She looked at the viewport again and stopped asking questions. The Oresi delegation lead arrived 3 minutes after the Thessari. His name was Ambassador Trent Cole, no relation to Ray Cole, a tall figure with 20 years of senior diplomatic experience and the particular posture of someone who had represented a significant civilization for long enough that the representing had become structural rather than performed. He found a position at the forward railing and put both hands on it and looked at the approach corridor. He had served as an observer at 2 previous council sessions where human vessels had been part of the proceedings. He had read the assessment reports. He had attended the briefings. He had a reasonably current understanding of human capability as documented in the official intelligence record. He stood at the railing and looked at what was moving through the approach corridor and understood within about 90 seconds that the official intelligence record was going to need to be updated after this summit in at least one specific category. He did not say anything. He kept his hands on the railing and watched. The Drenali senior attaché, a figure who appeared in the session records of several previous council proceedings in the specific capacity of someone who ran calculations at significant moments and put the results away because the results required a moment, arrived with the main body of the Drenali delegation and found a position near the center of the deck. He was a methodical and technically capable analyst named Attaché Vaughn who had been in his role long enough to have witnessed several things that had required significant revision of his models. He pulled out his personal computation unit. He looked at the approach data on the nearest display panel. He ran the calculation. He looked at the result. He put the unit in his pocket. His colleague standing next to him asked what the number was. Vaughn said he would tell him in a few minutes. His colleague looked at the viewport and then back at Vaughn and decided the few minutes was reasonable. The Constant was resolving now. The distance had closed enough that the viewport was showing it as a shape rather than a point, the specific process of a very large object at significant distance becoming clearer as it moved closer, each moment of resolution revealing more of the complete picture in the way that large things revealed themselves gradually regardless of how fast they were moving. The room had been producing the normal ambient noise of a large group of people in a shared space. Quiet conversations, the movement of people finding positions, the various sounds of individuals processing something together. As the Constant resolved on the viewport, the ambient noise reduced. Not to silence, but toward it. In the way that rooms moved toward silence when the thing in front of them was absorbing attention that would otherwise have gone into conversation. The Constant moved into the holding position assigned to it by the station's revised berthing plan. The maneuver was clean and precise, the kind of movement that large vessels made when their crews knew what they were doing and had done it enough times that the scale of the thing they were operating did not translate into any clumsiness in how they operated it. Gold frequency navigation lights. Ceremonial approach configuration. Identification beacon on the standard diplomatic frequency. Everything correct. Everything by the protocol. The holding position settled. The Constant was stationary relative to the station now. Stationary and entirely visible from the observation deck in its full scale. Envoy Kala had been standing at the front viewport since before the Constant was visible as a resolved shape. She had watched the entire approach. She was still looking at the viewport, and she had the expression of someone who has processed a great deal of new information and has integrated it into their model of the situation and is now considering what the revised model implies for the work they have to do tomorrow. Trent Cole was still at the railing. He had not moved from it since he arrived. He had been looking at the approach corridor for 25 minutes, and now he was looking at the holding position, and his hands were still on the railing in the same grip they had settled into when he first put them there. Vaughn had not yet told his colleague what the number was. The room was quiet in the way that rooms were quiet after something significant had arrived and settled, and was now simply present in a way that didn't require anything additional to make its point. Then the door at the back of the deck opened and Ambassador Kate Briggs came in. She was 20 minutes later than everyone else. She had been in her delegation's offices completing her preparation for the following day's sessions. The briefing review, the document check, the final run through the agenda items that she did before any significant proceeding to make sure she had everything she needed clearly in mind. She had received the notification the same time as everyone else and had noted it and had finished what she was doing before she came up. She came through the door and moved through the crowd with the polite and unremarkable efficiency of someone navigating a full room and found a position near the front where she had a clear sight line to the viewport. She looked at the Constant in its holding position. She looked at it for a moment with the same direct and complete attention she applied to everything. Then she turned to the two nearest delegation representatives, the Thessari technical advisor on her left and a junior Oresi staff member on her right, and said good morning in the same tone she used to say good morning to people in corridors when she was on her way to a meeting. The Thessari technical advisor said good morning back with the slightly delayed response of someone whose attention had been somewhere else. The Oresi junior staff member said good morning and then looked at the viewport and then back at Briggs and then at the viewport again. Briggs looked back at the viewport. The Constant was there in its holding position. Gold navigation lights. Ceremonial configuration. Patient and stationary and entirely itself. Someone near the back of the observation deck asked their colleague a quiet question. The colleague answered in an equally quiet voice. A few conversations started up again around the edges of the room, the careful, measured conversations of senior diplomatic professionals beginning the process of talking through what they were looking at. Envoy Kala said something quietly to her technical advisor. He responded. She nodded once. Trent Cole finally took his hands off the railing. He straightened up and looked at the viewport for one more moment and then turned and began making his way through the crowd toward the door. He had seen what he came to see and he had thinking to do, and thinking was better done somewhere quieter than a room with 100 people in it. He passed close to where Briggs was standing. He stopped. He looked at her with the direct and professional assessment of someone in a significant diplomatic role encountering a counterpart and making a rapid evaluation. He said, "Your vessel follows the protocol correctly." Briggs looked at him. She said yes. He said, "The protocol did not anticipate your vessel." She said, "No, it didn't." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "Tomorrow should be an interesting session." She said she was looking forward to it. He moved through the crowd and through the door. Briggs turned back to the viewport. The Constant sat in its holding position in the gold navigation light of a ceremonial approach and waited with the patient and absolute stillness of something that was exactly where it was supposed to be. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. She was ready for it. Tuesday morning arrived with the specific quality of a day that knew it was going to matter. The session chamber was ready when the delegations began arriving at 0845. The room had been set up with the precision that 3 years of planning produced. The senior tier table at the center, the delegation positions arranged in the configuration that the pre-summit negotiations had established after 6 weeks of discussion about seating order that had been more diplomatically significant than most of the substantive issues. The lighting was even. The document systems were verified. The translation infrastructure that allowed 23 civilizations to conduct a single conversation was running and tested and confirmed operational. The station's administrative staff had arrived at 0600 to complete the final preparations. Director Paul Hendricks had personally walked the chamber at 0700 and found nothing requiring correction, which was either a testament to his team's work or to the fact that the chamber had been ready since Sunday and had simply been waiting for Tuesday to arrive. The delegations filed in between 0845 and 0855. Ambassador Kate Briggs led the human delegation through the chamber door at 0852 and walked to the human delegation's position at the senior tier table with the unhurried directness of someone who knew where she was going and had been ready for this moment since before she left her office. She had her materials organized the way she always organized them, the agenda document on the left, the reference file in the center, her personal notes on the right, each item in the position she had used for every significant session in 12 years, because consistent physical organization meant she never had to think about where things were and could put all her attention on what was being said. She sat down and looked at the chamber. 23 delegations. The full senior tier table occupied. The document system showing green across every position. The translation indicators running clean. 3 years of preparation arriving at the moment it had been preparing for. The session chair, a senior official from the Neutral Stations Administrative Corps named Director Ann Walsh, chosen specifically because she represented no member civilization and could therefore chair the session without the appearance of any party's influence, called the session to order at precisely 0900. She opened with the standard procedural language that formal summit sessions required and then moved directly to the first agenda item. The integration terms. This was the core of what the 3 years had built. The specific language that would establish humanity's rights, responsibilities, and standing in the senior tier. It had been negotiated through 17 drafts across 27 months, and the version in front of the chamber was the version that every party had indicated their acceptance of in the pre-summit confirmation process. Kate engaged with it the way she engaged with everything, directly and specifically, having clearly read every line and thought carefully about what each line meant and what questions it might generate. When the chair opened the floor for comments on the first section, Kate had 2 substantive observations that were precise and constructive and that moved the discussion forward rather than reopening territory that the pre-summit negotiations had already closed. The session ran through the morning on schedule. 2 items completed before the midday break. The integration language was confirmed. The mutual recognition framework, the section that established the formal terms by which existing senior members acknowledged humanity's new standing, was reviewed and confirmed without significant dispute. This was faster than the schedule had anticipated. The pre-summit projections had estimated that mutual recognition would take most of the first day based on the complexity of the pre-summit negotiations around that section. Kate's preparation had apparently anticipated every point that might require additional discussion and had addressed each one before it could become a point. The afternoon session opened after the break and moved into the framework for humanity's expanded role in collective decision-making. The section governing how humanity would participate in the processes that actually shaped the galactic community's direction. This section was substantive and generated genuine discussion. Not dispute, discussion. The kind of careful, engaged exchange that happened when multiple significant civilizations were working out the practical details of a significant structural change and wanted to get the details right. Kate participated in this discussion the same way she had participated in everything else. When she had a position, she stated it clearly. When she had a question, she asked it directly. When someone else made a point that was accurate and complete, she said so and moved on rather than restating it with her own framing attached. The Thessari senior envoy, Kala, had been watching Kate across the table for most of the day with the analytical attention she brought to things she was in the process of assessing. At one point during the afternoon session, she asked Kate a clarifying question about the decision-making participation framework. Kate answered it in 2 sentences. Kala said thank you and made a note. The efficiency of the exchange was apparent to everyone near enough to observe it. The session was proceeding on schedule and had produced more substantive progress in a single day than the pre-summit projections had estimated for day 1.5 when the Oresi delegation lead asked his question. It was midway through the second afternoon session. The chamber had been in productive working mode for 6 hours at that point, the kind of sustained focus that significant diplomatic work required and that experienced delegations were capable of maintaining when the work was genuinely important to all parties. Trent Cole, the Oresi delegation lead who had stood at the observation deck railing the previous morning and had been one of the last people to leave, raised his indicator for the floor. The chair recognized him. He said he had a question for the human delegation that was not on the agenda. The chair noted this and indicated it was appropriate to raise. Trent looked at Kate directly. He said, the ANS constant. He asked whether it was a representative example of humanity's current Titan-class vessel capability or whether it had been selected specifically for this occasion as an exceptional vessel. The question was professionally framed, formally courteous, asked in the even and measured tone of a senior diplomat requesting factual information. The chamber was already paying attention because the chamber had been paying attention to everything all day. But the quality of attention shifted when the question landed. The shift was subtle, not a visible disruption of the session's professional composure, but a change in the particular focus that 23 delegations brought to the next moment. Kate looked at him. She considered the question for approximately 2 seconds. Not because it was complicated. Because she was a thorough person and 2 seconds of consideration before answering a direct question was her standard regardless of whether the question required it. She said the ANS constant was the newest vessel of its class. She said it in the same tone she had used for every answer all day. Straightforward. Complete. No elaboration beyond what the question asked for. The chamber paused. Not briefly. The kind of pause that settled in and stayed because the people in it were processing something that required the full attention of the processing and were not available for the session to continue in the meantime. The chair waited a reasonable interval and then indicated the floor was open for continued agenda discussion. The floor did not immediately take up agenda discussion. The Drenali senior attaché Vaughn had his personal computation unit out. He was running a calculation that everyone near him could see he was running and that the people near him had privately been expecting him to run since the question was asked. He finished it. He looked at the result. He put the unit away. His colleague asked him quietly what the number was. Vaughn said he would tell him after the session. The chair brought the session back to order. The agenda items resumed. But the session had a different quality in its second half than it had in its first. Not less professional, the work continued to be conducted with the full competence and engagement of 23 senior delegations. But underneath the professional surface of the agenda items there was now an additional layer of processing happening in every delegation simultaneously. The kind of processing that ran quietly alongside the official business and that would eventually produce the off-agenda questions that kept the summit running for 2 additional days beyond the scheduled close. Kate engaged with the remaining agenda items with the same direct and prepared efficiency she had brought to every item since 0900. At the session close she gathered her materials in the organized way she gathered everything and walked out of the chamber with her delegation. Her senior staff member walked beside her. He said it had been a good day. She said yes. He said the Oresi question had produced a notable pause. She said I answered it accurately. He said he knew. He asked if she had anticipated it. She said she had anticipated something like it. She said the observation deck had been full of senior diplomats who had been looking at the constant for 20 minutes before she arrived and that senior diplomats looking at things they had not previously accounted for tended to produce questions eventually. Her staff member said eventually had been about 18 hours. Kate said that was faster than she had expected. She went back to her office. Tomorrow was going to have more questions. She was going to answer them the same way she had answered today's. Wednesday was supposed to be the last day. The summit schedule had been designed for 2 full sessions, Tuesday for the Integration Terms and Mutual Recognition Framework, Wednesday for the Collective Decision-Making Framework and the signing ceremony. Clean, efficient, appropriately paced for the significance of the occasion without being padded beyond what the work required. Wednesday opened with the signing ceremony on the schedule for 1600. By Wednesday afternoon it was apparent that 1600 was not going to happen. Not because anything had gone wrong. The agenda items were progressing. The document language was coming together with less friction than the pre-summit negotiations had predicted. Kate's preparation and direct engagement had moved several sections through discussion faster than the projected timelines had estimated and the document was in better shape by Wednesday afternoon than it had been projected to be. The problem was the questions. They had started on Tuesday afternoon with Trent Cole's question about the ANS constant and the pause that followed Kate's answer. That pause had not fully resolved by the end of Tuesday's session. It had been professionally managed back into the agenda flow by the chair and the work had continued, but the processing that the pause represented had continued running underneath the professional surface and it had been generating questions. Wednesday morning's session opened with 3 off-agenda questions before the chair had finished the procedural opening. Kate answered all 3. Directly, completely, in the same straightforward tone she had used for everything since she arrived. The answers were accurate and the accuracy of each one required the room to take time before it moved on because accurate answers to questions about humanity's current capability and developmental trajectory were answers that had implications and the implications required processing. The Thessari senior envoy Kala asked the first question. She asked about the construction timeline for the Titan-class program. Specifically, whether the ANS Constance development had been concurrent with the summit preparation or whether the program predated the integration process. Kate said the program predated the integration process by several years. Calla was quiet for a moment. She said, so the Constant was not built for this occasion. Kate said no. It was built because humanity assessed that vessels of this class were an appropriate component of its defensive infrastructure and then built them. Calla made a note. The second question came from a mid-tier delegation that had been quiet through most of Tuesday, the Brennan Compact's senior representative, a careful and precise diplomat named Envoy Dale who had been watching the proceedings with the specific attention of someone storing information for later analysis. He asked about humanity's outer system development, specifically, the rate of settlement expansion over the past decade. Kate gave him the figures. Dale looked at his notes. He asked to follow up about the infrastructure development rate in the new settlements. Kate gave him those figures too. Dale made a note and said thank you and the session moved on. The third question was from Vaughn. He asked Kate to confirm the power output figures for the Titan-class drive system. Kate confirmed them. Vaughn said thank you. He did not take out his computation unit. He had apparently already run that calculation. Director and Walsh brought the session back to the agenda. The agenda work continued. It continued well. Kate was as prepared on Wednesday as she had been on Tuesday and the document sections moved through discussion at the same efficient pace. But the off-agenda questions kept coming, not in bunches that disrupted the flow but in the steady rhythm of a room that had ongoing processing running in the background and that periodically needed to surface a question to advance the processing. By Wednesday afternoon it was clear that the signing ceremony was not going to happen at 1600. Walsh called a brief administrative recess at 14:30 and consulted with the senior delegation leads about extending the summit. The consultation was brief. Every delegation agreed to the extension without hesitation, which was itself a data point about how the delegations were experiencing the sessions. Nobody wanted to leave before the questions had been worked through and the questions were not finished. The summit was extended to Thursday. Thursday was extended to Friday morning. Not by agreement to extend it. By the natural accumulation of the work, the agenda items and the questions and the time that each honest answer required the room to take. Kate answered everything. Every off-agenda question that came to the floor across 4 days received the same treatment as every agenda item. Direct engagement, accurate information, no management of how the information landed. She had decided before the summit that honesty was the only mode that served the occasion and the decision held across 4 days without wavering. On Thursday afternoon the Oresi delegation lead asked the question that the room had been building toward since Tuesday. He asked Kate what humanity wanted from senior tier membership. Not what the integration document said. What humanity actually wanted. He asked it directly and he asked it to her directly in the way he had asked the constant question on Tuesday, straightforwardly, as a genuine request for information. Kate looked at him. She said humanity wanted what it had wanted for 40 years. To participate in the processes that shaped the galactic community as a full party rather than a managed one. To have its assessments treated as the assessments of a civilization with standing. To contribute to the collective decisions that affected the space humanity occupied. And to do all of this as what it currently was rather than what a 40-year-old assessment said it had been on the way to becoming. She said humanity was already what it was going to be recognized as being at the signing. The recognition was catching up to the reality rather than defining it. The room was quiet for a moment. Trent said, "Yes. We understand that now." He said it simply and without self-consciousness. A straightforward acknowledgement from someone who had been processing the same thing for 4 days and had arrived at the clear end of the processing. The signing ceremony happened Friday morning. Walsh opened the ceremony with the formal language that the protocol required and the document was presented in the official format that the 3 years of preparation had produced. 23 delegations. 23 signatures. The order had been negotiated as part of the pre-summit preparation and each delegation signed in the agreed sequence. Kate signed for humanity midway through the sequence. The position that humanity's standing in the integration order had placed them, which was appropriate and which Kate had engaged with without any interest in renegotiating it because the position in the signing order was not the point. When the last signature was in place, Walsh declared the accord ratified and humanity formally entered the senior tier of galactic membership. The chamber produced the kind of quiet that followed significant things being formally completed. Not silence exactly, the ambient sounds of a room full of people were present. But a quality of attention that acknowledged what had just happened and gave it the moment it deserved. Kate thanked the assembled delegations for their engagement across 4 days. She said the sessions had produced something more thorough and more honest than the pre-summit planning had anticipated, and that humanity considered that a better outcome than the efficient 2-day signing that had been originally scheduled. She said the ANS Constant would remain in its holding position until the human delegation was ready for departure and would escort them home. She wished all attending delegations safe travels. She gathered her materials and the closing ceremony concluded and the delegations began the process of departure. The corridor outside the chamber had the particular energy of the end of something significant. People moving with purpose and the quiet conversations of individuals processing the same event from their own angles. Trent Cole was moving through the corridor with his senior staff when he passed Vaughn moving in the same direction with the Drenali delegation. Trent stopped. Vaughn stopped. They had been in the same sessions for 4 days. They had exchanged the specific looks of people who were tracking the same pattern from different positions. They had not spoken directly about any of it. Trent looked at the viewport at the end of the corridor. The Constant was visible from it. The holding position was in the corridor's sight line and the vessel was there the same way it had been there since Monday morning. Patient and stationary and entirely itself. He said, "We spent 40 years thinking we understood what humanity was becoming." Vaughn said, "I know." They stood at the viewport for a moment. Not long. Just the moment that the observation required before the work that came after it. Trent said, "The integration document is going to need implementation planning. The frameworks we agreed don't run themselves." Vaughn said his delegation was already thinking about the working group structure. Trent said his was too. They looked at the Constant for another moment. Then Trent said he needed to get back to his staff and Vaughn said the same and they moved in their respective directions with the purposeful energy of people who had understood something important and were ready to work with the understanding rather than just sit with it. Behind them through the viewport the ANS Constant sat in its holding position in the gold navigation light of its ceremonial configuration. The galaxy had changed on Friday morning. The new version of it was already waiting for everyone to get back to work.